It is especially good to see so many people here who did not get the memo. Or maybe you did get the memo, but you decided to consciously ignore it. And by the memo, I mean the memo that has been distributed sort of far and wide lately, and equally so by people on the nominally liberal left as by those on the right, though perhaps for different reasons. The memo which says that we are not really supposed to gather for conversations like this, that we are not supposed to get together to discuss the issues that will be discussed in this room this evening, the issues of race and racism and racial inequity and white privilege and institutional injustice and oppression of our brothers and sisters of color. We are not to speak of those things, so says this memo that again has been distributed so far and wide in recent years, because to discuss it is to be divisive, it is to deepen the racial divisions that have roiled us as a nation for so long. It is to ignore the fundamental don't you know, the critical don't you know, and the utterly false truth spoken by then State Senator, soon to be U.S. Senator, and now President of the United States, Barack Obama, back in 2004. It was the first time that most of us became familiar with him at all. He was running for the U.S. Senate. He was picked to give the keynote address, as you may recall, at the Democratic National Convention in Boston. And at that time, he got up and he gave a talk that was, as is so true for so many of his speeches, met with rounds of extended applause. One line, though, stuck out. It was a line you may very well remember. It is a line that I opened my latest book with. It is the line where he said, "We're not a black America and a white America. We're not a Latino America and an Asian America. We're the United States of America." Man, was that an incredible line. I mean, the applause went on for like 15 hours. Started at 9 o'clock. About 11, I was sleepy and needed to go to bed. I had 2 small children. I knew they'd be up soon. Went to bed, woke up the next morning, turned on the Today Show, and they were still this line. Amazing. I'm exaggerating, but only by about that much. We're a United States of America, is what he said. Of course, even as he spoke those words, a man as intelligent as he, as well-read as he, as erudite as he, as informed as he, must have known as he spoke them that he was speaking an untruth, a profound distortion, one might even say a lie, for political purposes. Because even as he said it, that summer, that very summer, a report had been released from MIT and the University of Chicago, both of their economics departments, neither of them notorious for being left-wing departments by any stretch, quite the opposite, which said what? That job applicants with white-sounding names were 50% more likely to be called back for interviews than those with so-called black-sounding names, even when all the qualifications, credentials, experience, seniority, education were identical, indistinguishable, which is to suggest that this claim that we were a united nation as opposed to a very divided one was not at all true. At the very moment that then State Senator, soon to be U.S. Senator, now President Barack Obama, argued that we were a united place and received all of that applause, the Justice Department at that very moment was gathering data about which I'm quite certain he was aware, which found what? That black and Latino males, 2 to 3 times more likely than their white counterparts, to have their vehicles stopped and then to be physically searched for drugs or other illegal contraband, even though white males, on the occasions when we are searched, are 4 times more likely, according to the Justice Department, to actually have this stuff on us. I'd like to repeat that so we're clear about the data. Black and brown men, 2 to 3 times more likely to be stopped. White men, 4 times more likely to be guilty on the occasions when we are. Now, I did not need a Justice Department report to tell me this. I knew this from personal experience, and I can speak about it because the statute of limitations has expired. And because I'm in church. And even though I'm Jewish, that supposedly means something. I can tell you. See, I worked as not a black or a white America or Latino America or whatnot. He was saying that in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, because our political system insists that those who would be our leaders lie to us. We can't have this conversation because we're told that if we have the conversation, it only makes the problem worse. We should talk less about race and the problem will go away. Now, I want you to ask yourself, about what other social problem would we say that with a straight face? Would we say that about any other social problem? That the less we talk about it, the better the situation will be. I'll give you a few examples. World hunger. Perhaps we could say that if we stopped talking about world hunger, food would miraculously appear on the plates of the starving. But no one would say that. Or crime. Maybe if we didn't talk about crime, no one would ever get held up at gunpoint again. See how easy that is? Why, we should just stop talking about it. Or educational failures, schools not educating children. Well, why don't we just stop talking about it? Everyone will get AIDS. It makes no sense. To blame the dialogue, to blame the conversation about racism for the problem of racism is like blaming your speedometer for the speeding ticket that you just got. Makes no sense. The speedometer did not cause you to get the speeding ticket. The speedometer just told you what happened. It's sort of just an indicator of a problem. It's not the problem. We're told we have to move on. That's a precious one. We're told that we can't. To acknowledge the reality of the problem throughout our history, we'll say, well, it's all true, Tim, but it really at some point we just have to really, and I know it doesn't sound right, and I know it might sound harsh, but at some point we just have to move on. We can't dwell in the past. Now that's interesting. Being articulated in a country such as ours, which maybe more so than any country on earth dearly loves to live in the past. We love that stuff. We do it all the time. That's what July 4th is, in case y'all hadn't figured that out. That breaking away from the British thing, that didn't happen last week. It was a really long time ago. We keep on talking about it, and we keep on setting off fireworks for it, and eating hot dogs and apple pie. Dressing up in red, white, and blue, big I Heart the USA buttons on our hats. That is living in the past. No one complains about it. And I have to say, it's a bit ironic and odd and a bit contradictory and even absurd and intellectually obscene for people on the right in particular to claim that people of color should move past the past when they have deemed those on the right their own political movement that should be called the Tea Party. Because I think that also is a rather old reference. When you come to rallies in tri-corner hats and Revolutionary War costumes and powdered wigs carrying muskets and speaking Old English, you are really not in a position to tell anyone else to get past the past. Feel free to lead by example. Let go of that. Move on. Get over it. Something. Right? But they just want some to get past the past, not themselves. We have to be honest that we've inherited these horrific legacies, you see, and we live with them today. The past is not some compartmentalized thing that we can put in a box and simply talk about it in a history class and then come to the present as if it never happened. Life is not like a video game, where you can hit start over or replay or reset because you don't like the way the game is going. We teach our children in like 3rd or 4th grade about this concept of inertia, right, as a physical property. The idea that an object in motion will continue in the same general direction until the force equal to greater weight pushes against it to stop its forward motion. But what we don't tell our children, and what we may not know ourselves, is that inertia is not just a property of the physical universe. It is a property of the socioeconomic and the political and the cultural universe as well. And so that which happens in one generation affects the next, and the next, and the next, right on down the line until the force of equal to greater weight pushing against it changes that trajectory. We are that force or not. That is up to us. But make no mistake that the inertia of all that past continues to affect us. And so right now as I speak, not 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, 20, 30, 40, or 50, but right now and next week and next month, unless something changes, and I dare say between now and then it will not, the median net worth for white families in this country, not the median net worth for wealthy white families, I just mean for average, everyday white families, is about 11 to 12 times that of the median for black families, 8 times that of the median for Latino families. It is not because we have worked harder. It is not because we have prayed harder, God knows. It is not because we as white folks possess some superior investment wisdom about which people of color are sorely lacking. I mean, if we have learned nothing from the current economic meltdown, perhaps we could at least walk away with this lesson intact. Shall we? And that lesson is this, that a handful of rich white men can lose a lot of money without any help from black people, without any help from Mexican folk, without any help from Asian Americans, without any help from indigenous Native North American First Nations peoples, without any people of color even in their Rolodex, let alone in their neighborhood, just the wealthiest, smartest, MBA having, high IQ, high SAT, MCAT, LSAT, GRE having white dudes on Wall Street took $12 trillion of wealth and destroyed it in 5 years. That is fascinating. 20% of all the wealth accumulated in this country's history over a 2-century-plus period gone in 5 years. Do you have any idea how long it would take for black and brown street thugs to steal $12 trillion? I mean, if you've given it any thought, how long it would take for all the black and brown street thugs combined to walk off with the kind of money that a handful of rich white guys just evaporated from the world economy and our own wealth as a country in a matter of 5 years? No, you can't, because it couldn't be done. We're still more afraid of black and brown street thugs, or even not street thugs, just black and brown men, period, thug or not, crossing the street towards us in a hoodie than we are afraid of rich white men driving around in their Lexuses, or maybe the proper term is Lexi, I don't know. Maybe some of y'all English majors tell me the proper form, but you understand, because we've inherited that legacy too, you see. Not just the wealth disparities, but we've inherited the legacy of who we're supposed to fear. And we're supposed to fear the usual suspects. We're supposed to be afraid of them, even though they could not do the kind of damage to this country and to us individually and collectively as a society if you gave them 5,000 years to do the deed that some have done in less than a decade. So we've inherited all that legacy. We've inherited something else too, and I think about it as a father, you see, very often. We've also inherited this mentality that justifies all of it, that rationalizes all of the inequality, that makes it okay, makes it seem like it's no big deal. What am I talking about? I'm speaking of the operative methodology, modality, the operative mythology of America, the secular gospel, if you will. You know? What is the secular gospel of this country? It's very simple. And it's something that we're all raised on, whether we are white or of color, whether we are male or female, rich or poor, middle class, working class, anywhere in between, gay, straight, doesn't matter whether we are Christian, Jew, Muslim, agnostic, atheist, Buddhist, anything else. Whatever we are exposed to this secular gospel. It is the myth of meritocracy, this idea that wherever we end up in life is all about us. And so if we made it, it's because we worked harder. If we didn't, it's our own fault. Now, if you raise children on that, and I understand why we tell children that, it's supposed to incentivize hard work. I get it. I get it. But if you tell people that and you do not give them the asterisks at the end of the sentence that leads them to actually explore all the things that make that statement untrue, like the institutionalized racism, institutionalized sexism and patriarchal oppression of women, institutionalized straight supremacy and cisgendered supremacy, that being the term for those who are not transgendered, in case you are not familiar with the term. If you do not talk about all the things, the class system and all the things that get in the way of that mythology being accurate, then those young people grow up having been told the myth, not given the caveat to the myth, and then they come to their own conclusions, as children are wont to do, right? Because if I tell a child, wherever you end up is all about your own hard work and your own effort, then that child becomes an adult and they can look around and they can see the disparity with their own eyes. They don't have to be a sociologist to do it. They don't have to be an anthropologist to do it. They just have to be awake. And they look around and they know who has what, and they start to ask why. And they know who doesn't have what, and they start to ask why not. And if the only thing we've given them is this idea and the notion of individualism and merit, then the only conclusions they can reach are racist ones. The only conclusions they can reach are sexist ones. The only conclusions they can reach are classist ones. Right? Ones that say, well, the reason those folks are at the bottom disproportionately is because there's something wrong with them. Maybe it's their culture, maybe it's their family, it's their mama, or maybe even it's their genes, it's their biology, their DNA, something's wrong, you see. So we've inherited this legacy of this mythology, and it does its own work on otherwise innocent people who were taken from that notion of innocence and turned into something that they weren't meant to be. We've also inherited the legacy of white racial resentment and anxiety that has long proved to be one of the engines of institutional oppression and racism. You see, a lot of times we say things like the new racism, or we talk about white racial backlash. You know, I've even used these terms, but they're not particularly precise, are they? Because a lot of what we're hearing today really isn't all that new, and a lot of it really can't be considered backlash, when in fact it was frontlash over 100 years ago. What I mean by that is this: if you go back to the period of Reconstruction, go back to the period after enslavement was rooted out of and I say formal enslavement, because all kinds of informal enslavement remained, of course, afterward, with debt peonage and things of that nature. Go back to the period right after Reconstruction. You know, the United States Congress, not necessarily for the right reasons, but they did pass legislation that in effect was intended, at least in theory, to provide a modicum of opportunity to those who had been owned as chattel previously. They created the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank, both of which, of course, would be destroyed within a very short period of time by those who did not want to provide that modicum of opportunity. And one of the ways that those things were destroyed was by action of the Supreme Court, which said, in a very famous case, Justice Joseph Bradley, writing the decision to the court, said, and this is a direct quote, that it was time for the Negro to no longer be the special favorite of the laws, to take their place among mere citizens. The idea being what? That the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank were, in effect, reverse discrimination. That was not the term they used, but that was the logic. That was the underlying argument, that after about a decade of freedom, those things were too much, and now it was disadvantaging white folks. So black folks needed to just become mere citizens and not be special citizens, which I dare say very few, if any, black folks realized they were in 1876 and 1877. So a lot of what we hear today isn't really all that new about reverse discrimination and white folks being victimized and people of color being favored. It's just as inaccurate, of course, now as it was then, just as absurd as it was then. Then in the 1930s, when black folks began to, in large numbers, move north, and one of the great migrations that we've had in this country, a lot of similar backlash took place, a lot of white racial resentment and anxiety took place, race riots every few months, white folks attacking black neighborhoods, burning down entire black neighborhoods, attacking black schools and businesses, etc., became a very common thing. Nowadays, we have a much more sophisticated way of rioting against folks of color. You see, after a while, you learn you can't do it the old way. It doesn't look very good. You can't just attack people violently. I mean, some folks still do it, make no mistake. But there are a lot slicker ways to oppress a person, are there not? You can riot at the ballot box. You can riot within your institutions. You can riot with zoning laws that keep certain people from living in your community. You can riot by drawing educational district lines that maintain school segregation. The effect of that is the same as an actual physical riot, but it's all legal, and it isn't seen as violence. You see, it isn't seen as a problem. You can riot with a war on drugs. It isn't about drugs. Because if it were about drugs, I wouldn't be here talking to you. Today's white anxiety has four particular pillars that we ought to understand. Very important, because this is, in some ways, a unique moment, you see. White anxiety has always been around, white resentment has always been around, and this backlash has always been around whenever we've actually had any modicum of advancement for peoples of color. But now we've got this very special sort of perfect storm brewing for white anxiety. It's a very dangerous moment in our history. I want us to be able to reflect on it honestly. There are four pillars of this white anxiety. Together they make for this perfect storm, this sort of perfect, stew of white resentment, if you will. Number one is, of course, the election of the president of color, which, for some, poses a challenge to their long cultivated and nurtured notions of what leadership is supposed to look like. Because for some, the idea that leadership doesn't look like you, doesn't look like us, doesn't look like the majority, when we've been able to take for granted that it would, is disconcerting. So that's the first pillar. Now, that in and of itself wouldn't probably have done it. That in and of itself may not have been sufficient. But then you add to that the second pillar, which is what? The second pillar is the economic meltdown that we're experiencing right now, where white folks, for the first time since the Great Depression, are experiencing double-digit unemployment. I want to point that out. It's very interesting, is it not, that we've now decided we have an unemployment crisis. Because white folks have double-digit unemployment, which we haven't had in 75 or so years. Not to say that's not a crisis, it certainly is. But it was a crisis when only black folk and indigenous folk and Latino folk and Southeast Asian folk were experiencing it. And that's been decade after decade after decade. Going back a very long time. For black and brown folk, that's been the norm ever since we started keeping records. Maybe if we decided that it was a crisis when black teenage unemployment hit 44%, which happened 9 years ago, might have done something about it, but we didn't, did we? We didn't call for a stimulus bill. We didn't call for a jobs bill. We didn't call for legislation that would get the economy moving again in their neighborhoods. But once it happened to white folks, it was a crisis. Understand, when you add to the leadership change, man of color, challenging notions of leadership that are long cultivated, you add to that the economic insecurity, the economic anxiety that is actually quite uncommon for white folks, that scares Because then that lets us think as white folks that maybe our future is not as bright as we were told it was. We feel entitled to it. After all, that's the American dream. We were told it was ours. So if all of a sudden you realize it might not work out that way, that becomes the second pillar of anxiety. Oh my God, what am I going to do? The third pillar, a popular culture that is thoroughly multicultural. So that when some white folks look around, they don't see the popular culture icons that they remember from their youth who all look like them, and sang music that they liked, put on movies and television shows that they could relate to, that supposedly spoke to their life experience. Not that they really did, leave it to Beaver wasn't real. White women did really did housework in pearls and heels. There were white folks who liked to believe it was so. Made that show a hit. Those things were absurd, they were sweet, and they were innocent in the eyes of an awful lot of white folks. And so now you've got a popular culture that's so interwoven, so multicultural, some folks can't get their head around it. You have country music artists making records with hip-hop artists. What? Huh? And you turn on the CMAs and Kid Rock is on. What do I do with that? And that guy from Hootie and the Blowfish is making country music. And he's winning awards and stuff at the CMAs, and people are like, oh my God, bring back Hank Williams, please. So there are some folks not prepared because that challenges our cultural assumptions of normalcy. The idea that the culture is ours to define and to stipulate and to lay out, you understand it. So you add now the leadership challenge of what leadership looks like, the economic insecurity and anxiety, and the cultural challenge, and then add the fourth thing, and this is the biggest of all of them, but in combination with the other three, it really amplifies it sort of exponentially, is this demographic shift that's underway. It's been underway in this state and other states like California, New Mexico, Arizona, etc. But within the next 30 years, half the country will be people of color, half will be white. That's a fact. And although there are folks in Arizona who don't like it, there isn't much you can do about it. Average age of white folks in Arizona is about 137. I think all we have to do is be patient. A lot of longevity in that state. Must have good health care for some folks. So you add all of these things, a demographic shift which now challenges our assumptions of what America itself is, the U.S. of America, I should say. Challenges our notion of who our neighbors are to be and what is the prototypical definition of a quote-unquote American. Because for years, for generations, those of us who are white have been able to assume that when you look that up in the dictionary, were there pictures, it would look like us. That we were the very prototype of what an American was. So when I would do word association exercises 10 years ago with folks, I would say, all American boy, all American girl, what do you see? Not only white folks, but people of color too would see white folks. Still do sometimes. Although it is starting to change. And see, that scares some people. Because now you have folks of color, folks whose original language may not be English, folks whose religion may not be Christianity, folks whose heritage may be culturally totally different, all of them trying to claim a piece of this thing we call Americanism. And for those who've been able to assume that they were the norm, that they were the standard by God, that we were the floor model, who are you to challenge our assumptions of normalcy? You add all of that together, you see, and it creates this perfect storm for white anxiety. That's what we're dealing with, and that's why folks are so adamant that day, and I'm quoting them now, I'm not trying to put words in their mouth. You know, you've heard it, they've said it, they want their country back. Now see, I've been white a long time. I've been white like 42 and a half years. That's long enough to know that when white folks, particularly white folks older than myself, start talking about wanting their country back, it makes me nervous. And I know it makes black and brown folk nervous. Because we remember what that country was. So when, I don't mean to be ageist with this comment, but if you're like 70 or older and white and you're talking about wanting your country back, see, that's this out. Because I know what your country was, and here's the point, so do you. So if you're saying that, I know what you mean by it. I know what it is you're afraid of. Now, people try to lie. You know, people try to be real slick, and they say, oh, that's not what we need. I got an argument. That's no surprise. That happens a lot. But I got an argument about a year and a half ago with a woman who wrote to me. She's very upset. I'd written a piece in which I suggested, as diplomatically as I could, which is not very. I said, as I could, that maybe that rhetoric of wanting the country back had a little something to do with race. Just a little, just a little, just a little. Just a little. She wasn't happy. She was very upset. She looked at me. She said, that's not what we mean. We don't mean the part about slavery or segregation, the theft of half of Mexico and a war of aggression that we started on false pretense. We don't mean the part about, she didn't use that language, that was mine. But she didn't, we don't mean the part about Japanese internment. We don't mean the part about the genocide of indigenous people. And she went through a whole list of the stuff it didn't mean, leaving me to wonder exactly what was left. So I asked her, what is it? And she said, I'll tell you. I said, thank you, because I asked. Please do. And she said, well, when we say we want our country back, we just mean we want to go back to a time when taxes were low and government was small. I said, really? Fascinating. I would play your game. Pick a year. See, I wanted a year. Don't give me this amorphous, vague, rhetorical stance about small taxes and small government. That doesn't mean anything. You got to pick a date. I want to know what you want to go back to. Because when you say you want your country back, it's not take your country back to some bumper sticker. It's a statement about a time and place in our history. So tell me when. And see, here, this is a setup. I was setting her up because I knew what she was going to say. I knew, man. I mean, I didn't know exactly, but I had a range of years that I knew. It's sort of like that game show, The Price is Right. You know that game show where like the yodeler is going up the hill and he's yodeling? And you don't have to guess the price of the soap exactly. You just got to get it within like 40 cents or something. And if you get it within 40 cents, you get the car. And if you don't, your dude falls off the hill and dies. And you're embarrassed in front of millions of people on national TV. Let it suffice to say, if this is a game of Price is Right, I would have won the car. I knew what she was going to say. I asked her for a year. Now, she could have said, correct me if I'm wrong, she could have said 1898. But come on. She's not going to say 1898. Even though government was, relatively speaking, much smaller taxes, there was no IRS, there was no income tax. But nobody's going to say the good old days were 1898, because unless you were one of like six rich white dudes for their kids, life pretty much sucked for you then. So you weren't going to pick that. She could have picked 1911, like that's before the income tax. But really, no, she's not. Because children were working in factories in 1911. Nobody is so fool. They don't even say 1924. No one says, well, those were the good old days. We should go back to the mid-20s. Woohoo! I knew what she was going to say. She wasn't going to pick those eras. She was going to pick exactly, she said 1957. Of course she did. That's when Leave It to Beaver started. 1957. Now here's what's fascinating, and I asked her. She didn't know the answer. I will ask you rhetorically whether you know it or not. I intend to fill in the blank for you. Do you know what the top marginal tax rate was in 1957? It's a very important thing to know if we're going to have an honest conversation about anti-tax, anti-government, and what it is and isn't about. Because remember, she is proclaiming that that was an era she wants to go back to because, and that the Tea Party wants to go back to, of which she is a part, because it was low tax and small government. But in fact, the top marginal tax rate in 1957 was 91%. More than double what it is now, even if all the Bush tax cuts were to expire. 91%. Every dollar that you made over $300,000 that year, which is equal to $1 million now, 91 cents of it went to the government. So when you say you want to go back to that era because it's low tax, you don't know what you're talking about. Or you're lying about why you like that year. There's a reason why we misperceive that era as low taxes, though, and I want you to ask yourself what that might be. Why might we think of that as an era of low taxation, even when it was an era of much higher taxation than we have now? There is a reason it is explicitly about race, and I will come back to it. Before I do that, let's ask the second question that I asked her, again rhetorically. She had no answer for it. I said, do you think government was small in 1957? Because that's what you keep saying. Government was small, but was it? Was government small in the mid-1950s and late 50s? Not if you were white, it wasn't. It was pretty small for everybody else. But for white folks, it was huge, and it had been for a very long time. I mean, we could actually go back to the colonial period to see how big the state intervention in the markets had always been for dominant groups. We don't go back that far. This isn't a history class. I'll just take you back to the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave out 245 million acres of essentially free land to white folks. People of color essentially completely excluded from that, all west of the Mississippi, or at least most of it. About 40 million white folks today still living on that land, or who have benefited directly from the intergenerational transfer of that land, and have reaped some type of economic reward reward for it. I haven't seen any of those 40 million white folks going to their congressperson or senator, tapping them on the shoulder in D.C. and saying, okay, here's the deal. I'm really embarrassed about this. Can we keep this between us? Shh. I've got this ranch. Got this farm, house. Oh my God. It's been in my family for generations. They didn't really pay for it. I'm going to give it back to you. Don't make a big deal. Don't go to the press. I don't want this public knowledge that we've had this thing. I don't even pay me for it. I don't want money for it. I just want to give it to you for a song because, after all, were I to keep this house, it was given to my family by the government. That would be like, what's it called? That'd be like socialism. I love capitalism. See, that's what I'm all about. People take it. I'm not suggesting white folks should do that. I know they're not going to do that. I'm just pointing out the inconsistency. So government had been big for a long time. It got even bigger in the 20th century with the FHA and the VA loan programs, and later with the very racially selective way in which the GI Bill was administered. The FHA gave out $120 billion worth of housing equity preferentially to white families between 34 and 62. Right? This was an FHA lending program without which the white middle class would never have existed. Because prior to the creation of that program under the Roosevelt administration during the New Deal, banks wouldn't lend money to working class people. Even if you were white, they didn't care. They weren't going to give money to poor and working class folks to get a house. They had too big a risk. The government comes in and says, don't worry, we'll assume some of the risk. We'll underwrite and guarantee the loans against default. They said, okay, great. So they opened up the coffers of money, $120 billion in housing equity. If we gave $120 billion of anything to people of color, 240 million acres of land to people of color, you know what we call that. We call that welfare. We call it a handout. We did it for white folks. We called it nation building. Good macroeconomic policies. So government was huge. 40% of all white mortgages held by 1960 were written under a government preferential program, without which those families wouldn't have had a house. So when this woman was saying, when the Tea Party folks were saying, we want to go back to that era when government was small, they know not of what they speak. Government was huge, and it just started. History of the Social Security Act of 1935. Go back and read the legislative comments made by the congresspersons on the floor of the United States Congress explaining why they were creating cash welfare. What was at that time called Aid to Dependent Children, later AFDC, now TANF. Right? Because we know what the rhetoric today is about cash support for single moms and kids. But what was the rhetoric then? See, this just lets you know the important factor is the changing complexion of the perceived recipients. Because back then, when only white folks really had access because of the way those rules were written state by state, and at the federal level, you know what the rhetoric was? These Congress people got on the floor of the House and of the Senate, they said, we've got to have cash support for these white widows whose husbands have died. And these white women whose husbands have left home looking for work in some other state during the Depression. We've got to be able to support them so that they can stay at home, raise their children, and not have to go work in the paid labor force. Wow. Now, putting aside the patriarchal assumptions of that, which are bad enough, put aside how sexist it is to suggest that women should not be in the paid labor force, they shouldn't be at home. Put that aside for just a second and ask yourself how different that rhetoric is from that which we hear today. Because if I'm not mistaken, today the rhetoric is the polar opposite. The rhetoric today is if you're receiving cash assistance, you are lazy and pathological and dysfunctional and a member of some ghetto underclass and you should get a job raising your children. What kind of nonsense is that? Apparently it was good enough for white women. The state created these programs intentionally to bring about dependence of white women on the state. But as soon as people of color gained access, oh my goodness, no, this is bad for children and families. We can't do this, you see. So I would suggest you think about this because it's the only way we can really understand this crazy, silly political season in which everyone is sort of assuming government intervention in the markets, government intervention on behalf of the have-nots is a bad thing. That was not the rhetoric 70 years ago. It wasn't even close. That's a very recent phenomenon, a very modern phenomenon, and it traces exactly one-to-one, almost to the minute, when people of color began to gain access to those programs. That is not a coincidence, you see. So you can say that you're against big government and you want low taxes, and I'm not going to say that your motivation is inherently racist as a result of that, but trust me when I tell you that if you came of age in this country in the last 40 years, it is impossible to disentangle those two narratives. The one that is about government size and taxation size, and the other which is about black and brown folk. Those two narratives have been inherently woven together for almost a half a century. You cannot tell me that somehow they are unique and independent of one another, because they aren't. So this narrative is what the right wants to control. They want to erase the role of race in their narrative, even though the role of race in their narrative has been central. Now here's the sad fact. In response to the manipulation of that white racial anxiety, using coded language, using dog whistles like low taxes and small government and individual responsibility, never actually necessarily using terms that are overtly racist, but everyone knows what they mean. Unfortunately, in response, those on the nominally liberal left remain silent. At least silent insofar as one might otherwise call out what it really is. Because those on the liberal left are afraid, as Barack Obama in 2004 was afraid to acknowledge the truth about this country's ongoing racial divisions. So we talk about anything but race. We talk about health care. We don't talk about racism within the health care delivery system. We talk about health care, universal coverage, all of which is very important. I don't know anyone on the left who doesn't support it. We don't talk about the research now, over 100 studies in the last 10 years, all of which say what? Independent of your economic status, independent of whether you have health care coverage or not, independent of issues of access and affordability, black and brown folks are experiencing bodily health crises as a result of racism in their everyday lives. Over 100 studies, one of which published in the American Journal of Public Health in 1996, 8 years before Barack Obama gave that "We are a United States of America" speech, 12 years before he was elected, on the part of people who believed it was an evidence of post-raciality in our country. And what did the study say? It said that the consequences, the effects of racism and discrimination against people of color have just as much of an impact on blood pressure and hypertension and the related health consequences of those things as high-salt diets, lack of exercise, and smoking. But now we have declared obesity and smoking, for instance, to be public health issues. We haven't done that with racism, even though the evidence suggests that it is, because we cannot speak these truths. When we ignore that truth, when we avoid mentioning race and calling out those who are deliberately exploiting racial fears, a few things happen. Number one, we can't solve the problem. You can't solve a problem that you will not name or call out. Colorblindness, as Julian Bond has reminded us, just leaves us blind to the consequences of color, making it impossible for us to actually address it. The second thing is that ignoring the role of racism and discrimination in our everyday lives and our institutions enhances the denial on the part of white folks and even on the part of some folks of color that the problem is real. If you don't mention it, it must not be real. And God knows if the man of color in the White House doesn't mention it, lots of white folks say, well, then it can't be real. He's not talking about it, see? In fact, when they asked him, back a year or so ago when folks were marching around these rallies with signs picturing the president dressed like an African witch doctor with a bone through his nose. Oh, but that's not racist. No, that's just a sign. We didn't mean anything by it. We just thought it was funny. Just like that email we sent around with the White House lawn covered in watermelons. Now, that was just coincidental. We didn't mean anything by it. Right? And Jimmy Carter, former president, made a comment that had a little something to do with race. And they asked President Obama whether he agreed, and he backed off and said, oh no, I'm sure they're just anxious about the economy. Now, we are all anxious about the economy, but I don't remember ever being so anxious that I thought to myself, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get a piece of poster board, and I'm going to put a picture of the president dressed like an African witch doctor with a bone through his nose, because that might help me find a job. The president had to dissemble. The president had to prevaricate. The president had to deceive, because his political career, at least he believes, is dependent on that lie. If you want to know how not post-racial we are, that's all you need to know. Because if we were post-racial, this man could tell the truth and nobody could touch him precisely, because he can be touched and politically destroyed, or he still can be, and he remains silent. But the problem is we then play the same game. The president's going to do whatever he's going to do, but we do not have to play by those rules. office. We do not hold office. We do not have to cater to the whims of certain voters who do not want to face this subject. We have to be braver because we don't talk about it. We see the racial narrative to the right. They intend to use race against us. Make no mistake, they intend to use race and racism against even the mildest of progressive reforms. And if you don't believe me, all you have to do is look at what Glenn Beck said about the health care bill. I was at home a year and a half ago, late summer, and I'm watching television. I'm flipping around channels. I come across the Glenn Beck show, and for reasons that utterly escape me, I did not change the channel. I have a long-standing thing that I love circuses and carnivals and train wrecks, other moments of chaos. So I watched it, and I'm actually glad I did because it was very informative. You know, he looked right into the camera, and I was so sucked in. He was like, he was talking to me. You know, I want to know what this healthcare thing is all about, friends. He called me a friend. I'm like, yes, I do. Please tell me, Lynn. Please tell me. See, I had a thought. I sort of thought I knew, like, what's the healthcare thing about? I'm thinking, healthcare? Apparently, one would only think that if one were idiot, because Glenn has superior knowledge, and he explained it. He said, it's not about healthcare. I'm like, oh. Well, it was. Silly me. What is it? And he said, I'm going to tell you what it's about. It's really about this administration just trying to get reparations for slavery. Didn't see that coming, really. That one, even in the pantheon of asininity that has made up this man's entire career, that one was something special. And see, but here's the thing, here's the danger that we sometimes fall into, right, is we try to think this stuff through intellectually. We try to make sense of it analytically. Big mistake. Because intellectually it's absurd, right? I mean, what is it? Does he really think, like, what kind of reparations is it that you've got to get sick first to get paid? What kind of scam is that? Like, does he really think that black folks are sitting around going, I've got to figure out how to get this money? How am I going to get this money? How am I going to get this 40 acres and a mule? Hold up, I've got it! I know the plan now. I got to call all my friends. I get on the phone, call all their other black friends. I got a scam. I got a scam. You want to know how we're going to get paid? You want to know how we're going to get our 40 acres and a mule? I've got it. Really, what is it? What is it? Here it is. Check it out. Check it out. Check it out. Cancer. That's not a plan. It makes no sense. But see, that's the problem. I was trying to think it through analytically. The big mistake. It doesn't make any sense politically, but it doesn't have to make any sense on that level. It's actually quite genius, though, on an ideological propaganda level, right? Because what has he just said? He just basically looked at millions of white folks and said, they're coming for your money. When they get it, they're going to give it to those people. You see? That's genius. Intellectually, it makes no sense. Politically and propagandistically, it is a stroke of brilliance. You see? So they're going to play that game even though the president doesn't talk about race. The healthcare bill didn't say a thing about racism in the healthcare delivery system, and even then the right is going to beat him and anyone who supports even the mildest of reforms over the head with that stuff. You see? So at some point we either have to fight back or get used to the fact that they're going to use race against even the mildest of change while we remain silent, hoping that the subject will go away. But it shall not go away. Because they will continue to exploit it even more. For us not to talk about it squanders perhaps the best opportunity that we've had as leftists, as progressives, as radicals, whatever term you choose, to build solidarity across racial lines. We haven't had a lot of opportunities to do that in a very long time. This is one of those moments, but only if we are brave enough to call it out like it is. You see, here's the thing. A lot of times, particularly those of us who are white, we think that this issue is really a black or brown issue, that racism is a black or brown problem. Maybe we are altruistic enough to become involved in it, you know. We don't really see it as connected to our daily life, but we better start realizing how much it is. Just to be perfectly honest with you, if you think about this economic meltdown for a second, think about the global economic crisis has been triggered mostly by what the housing meltdown. Now ask yourself, think about the housing crisis, and the thumbnail, what is it? It was about banks and independent mortgage brokers and bank subsidiaries going into low-income neighborhoods, especially, but not only of color, but especially of color, and ripping folks off, basically giving them loan instruments that they knew full well they couldn't afford, but lying to them in many cases, and saying, oh, don't worry, you know, it's not going to balloon, the interest rate's not going to balloon for like 3 years, and we'll refi you by then, everything will be fine. Folks wanting a piece of that American dream that they've been told they're not real Americans without said, okay, and they signed on the dotted line. Now, the first time that I heard anything about this, what is called predatory lending, right? Folks getting loans at much higher interest than what they would have received with their credit scores had they been white, had they been middle class, etc., living in the suburbs. First time I read about that was 1993. This isn't new. I'm talking 18 years ago. Read a book about it, and it was talking about how these lenders, sometimes banks, other times they're subsidiaries, and then increasingly these independent mortgage brokers that are almost entirely unregulated by the state. The banks are regulated. The independent mortgage brokers, not so much. They were going in and ripping folks off, and at that time it was almost all in black and brown space. And I remember there was just no traction on this issue. You couldn't get anybody to talk about it. Congress people didn't really want to. Actually, the Congressional Black Caucus did. They're about the only ones. But no national leader in either of the two main political parties wanted to touch it, really. The media didn't want to talk about it. I remember bringing it up to people, and they would say, well, it's awful, but it doesn't really affect me, Or even worse, they would say what you sometimes hear now, which is, what if they're so stupid that they're not going to read the fine print on that loan document, then they deserve to lose their house. I paid my mortgage on time. They should too. Now, putting aside the ethicality of that indifference, one can make an argument it's pretty callous, but putting that aside for a second, that's a philosophical discussion we haven't time for tonight. Ask yourself about the practicality of that indifference almost 2 decades later. Because see, it's one thing to act like it doesn't matter when there's only 1 or 2 houses in your census tracts that have gone into foreclosure. Oh, you can afford to rock that self-righteous attitude about how you pay your mortgage on time and you never ask for a bailout and how dare these other people do that. You can do that, you see. When you are looking only at maybe 1 or 2 houses in your whole community that are in foreclosure. But when half the houses in your community are in foreclosure, because all of a sudden you've waited around a decade or 15 years or whatever it might be, and all of a sudden half the houses in your community are in foreclosure, in default. Now try to sell your house. Good luck trying to sell your home. You're not going to be able to sell your own house any longer because your own property values will have declined. Because you sat around and didn't care when other folks were suffering, you see. So in some regard, that indifference, which we thought wasn't affecting us, eventually does come back to haunt us. What are the two of the hardest hit communities in this country right now for mortgage foreclosures? Nassau County, Suffolk County. Look it up. Long Island, those are mostly white, overwhelmingly middle-class spaces, and they are suffering now because what the banks did and what the lenders did was they realized by the late 90s, early 2000s, the government was not going to stop them. They're not going to regulate us. We've been jacking these folks around in the hood. Why stop in the hood, man? Let's go to the suburbs. Let's go to the exurbs. You know what the exurbs are. Exurbs are this new geographic space that some folk carved out when the suburbs got too brown. We ran to the suburbs to get away from them, and some of them came with us. They like Olive Garden too. Didn't think they would do that. Now we got to carve out a new rim, call it the exurbs. And the bank said, cool, we'll go out there. And so now you got millions of white folks losing their stuff too. Millions of white folks facing that same kind of insecure future precisely because we didn't think this was a big enough problem. Just like that double-digit unemployment 10 and 15 and 20 years ago when only folks suffering were brown and black. You see? So at some point, you better start to care, not out of some charitable impulse or altruistic impulse, but because this is the opportunity to build solidarity, to realize that racial inequity that plagues us affects all working people, affects the entire economy on which all of us depend, affects the culture upon which all of us depend. But if we're not willing to call out the racism that's inherent to that anti-government discussion about not intervening in the housing markets and not intervening to create jobs and not intervening in a healthcare crisis, if we don't call out what that's about, we can't ever make these connections, you see. We can't connect those dots, and we're weaker for it. But it's not just that. I want you to understand that it's not just a systemic issue. It is that. And as a leftist, I sort of start and end with this sort of systemic institutional analysis. But one thing that I've learned, I don't know if I knew it before I was a dad, I certainly know it now, is that although it is systemic, and although it is institutional, and although it is structural, it's also deeply personal what those structures do to you, what those institutions do to all of us. And although I might have had a glimpse of it before I became a father, it never became clear to me that it was. A few years back, we were sitting around on a Sunday afternoon, my wife and my 2 daughters and I, and they were almost 6 and almost 4. It was a Sunday afternoon, early summer, school's out, raining outside, can't go out to the park, can't do anything fun outdoors. So we're trying to find something to do inside. We played every game in the house already. Kids are bored, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We're trying to find something to do, you know. So we turn on the cable satellite thing, on demand, whatever it is, $4.95, get a movie, trying to find some movie that might be good for kids. Turning around trailers, commercials, looking to see something. We didn't find much. We did come across the trailer for the movie Evan Almighty, which some of you might have seen. It's a cute film, fun. Steve Carell, right, plays a senator or congressperson who is told by God, who was played by Morgan Freeman, that a flood is coming and he should probably build a very large boat, one might say an ark, and ride it out. You've probably heard this story before in a different context. It's the modern retelling of the Noah and the Ark story. That's a funny movie, but as it turned out, my children and my wife had seen it. They'd gone to see it a few months earlier when it had been in the theaters. They weren't really interested in watching it again, but because the children recognized at least some of the dialogue, and they recognized in the trailer, in the commercial, they recognized the actors, you know. They looked up, it got their attention. The little one, Rachel, who's not quite 4 years old, looks up, sees Morgan Freeman in the role of God in the flowing white robes or whatever it was. She looks at me and she says exactly what a 4-year-old would say, which is, Daddy, is that really God? Right? Because that is what you'd say at 4. Like at 4, you don't know about the Screen Actors Guild. You don't know anything about casting directors. You just figured God wanted to make a movie. And if God wanted to make a movie, done. Doesn't take long to shoot. It's God. So she looked at me and asked me if that was God. I thought it was sort of funny. I chuckled. I said, no. That's not God. That's an actor. His name is Morgan Freeman. He plays God often. You will probably see him in this role again. But he's just a performer. He's just playing a role. And I thought that was the end of the conversation. But then the older of the 2 girls, Ashley, who was roughly 6, now she's caught wind of our conversation. She's interested. She's intrigued. She looks up. She sees Morgan Freeman in the role of God in the flowing white robes on the screen. She looks at her sister. She laughs. And she says, Rachel, that can't be God. And I knew 2 things. And I knew them as surely as I knew my name. Number 1, I was going to have to ask her why not. And number 2, I already knew what her answer was going to be before I asked the question, but I had to ask it. Now, I was hoping for some support from my wife, who was sitting over in this general vicinity. So I looked her way, looking for some words of wisdom, some insight, some brilliance that would get me out of this jam. I got nothing. Except a look that roughly said, well, this would be your area of expertise. So good luck. I'm going to go get a camera. I'm going to take pictures. I might even scrapbook this precious moment. I got nothing for you. I realized I was on my own, so I turned back to my child and asked her why. Why couldn't that be God? And she looked at me, and now, before she gave me her answer, I did have this fantasy, like this half a second or so, before she gave me the answer that I fully anticipated. It was a fantasy that she was going to come up with some really brilliant alternative to what I anticipated, like, oh, Dad, that can't be God because God's a woman, or that would be cool. Or even better, I really was hoping for like some existentialist answer, like, Father, what is God? Really, Father, why must we speak of these things? That would have been really cool. But and she's smart, but no, that's not. So she wasn't going to come up with that. Instead, her mouth begins to move, the words form, and I hear coming from her throat the very phrase that I knew I would hear, which is, that can't be God. And she said this with no sense of irony or misgiving. Can't be God because God isn't black, God is white. Now, I don't think it will shock any of you to learn that in my home, in our home as a family, there are no racialized images of a deity anywhere. There are actually no images of a deity, but if there were, they would not be racialized. Right? We don't have any of those awful, venal, I might even say evil Bible children's storybooks. Evil because of the symbolism and the imagery and the iconography, like the images that give you the impression that you didn't know any better. Adam and Eve had resided in the Garden of Sweden. We do not have any of that. You know? And yet, my child is picking up these ideas somewhere, not in our home, but somewhere, whether it's in a church, or whether it's at a friend's house, or a library, a bookstore, or on those Christmas cards we receive every holiday season, as I'm sure many of you do, with picture Jesus so white, so Europeanized, that he might as well have been born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The reason I'm telling you the story is very simple. If you were to try to break into my house and poison my children, I would kill you. And I'm not saying it because I'm all big and bad. I'm like 5'8" on a good day, so I'm not a violent person, but I will defend my family if you try to hurt them. And yet the thing is, something is coming into my house, and it is poisoning my children, and the doors are locked, and the windows are shut, the alarm is on, and this thing that is coming in does not know the code to turn off the alarm, and it gets in and it gets out as quickly as it came before either myself or my wife even knew it was there, and I resent it, and I resent it deeply, because what it says is that no matter how much we try to inoculate ourselves or our children, our loved ones, our friends, our colleagues from this poison, it will get you. And as long as that can happen in my home, in a home where we talk about these things regularly and we deconstruct this issue on a regular basis, not using with small children the term deconstruction, but you know what I mean. If it can happen there, it can happen in any of our homes. It can take us away from who we were meant to be, either by God, however you conceive of that, or by nature, or perhaps both. My daughter was not meant to be that, but she will be that unless and until we do the work. You see? And if that's the message that it sends to little white children, that they're closer to the creative force of the universe, again, however you conceive of that. And what does it say to black children? What does it say to brown children? What does it say to children of color? It says that they are farther from that same creative energy of the universe. Again, however conceived, it is deadly. It is a soul wound, far deeper than that which we can possibly imagine. And so at the end of the day, we have to fight this problem as if our lives depended upon it, because in both the physical, the social, and the cultural, and certainly in the spiritual and the ethical sense, they most certainly do. So as James Baldwin told us so many years ago, the world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in. Thank you all so much for being here.
Well, I mean, we can use the term, or we can articulate the concept of revolution. I think we have to start with a recognition that we are one of the most profoundly counter-revolutionary cultures on the planet. And that makes it very difficult not only to foment them, but to even discuss them. Other nations that have had more recent revolutions are not nearly as conservative, and I don't mean that in the modern political sense. I mean that in the structural sense, the way that the institutions have been created, the modalities and the methodologies and the paradigms of those nations. We have a couple of hundred years now where we've inculcated this notion that I discussed in the talk about this rugged individualism, this mythos of meritocracy. And it's so deeply embedded that the problem for most is that even when they see themselves at some level as oppressed, the idea of fundamentally uprooting the structures and revolutionary and fomenting revolution strike them as fantastical and virtually impossible. That doesn't mean it always has to be that way. It certainly doesn't mean we don't talk about it, but it means we have to begin where people are in the discourse. And that's true on any issue that we discuss. We can't always begin where we want people to be. We have to talk to them where they are. And if they are at this level where right now they believe, counter to, let's say, European nations where socialist revolution first became this concept that was so prevalent. Well, those were countries where if you were the working class, you knew it. And you knew you weren't going to be anything else. You knew you weren't going to be royalty. You were not going to be on top because you weren't in the lineage that would get you there. So you understood the game. And you understood the only way the game changed, frankly, was with revolution. We have a culture that tells us that's not true at all. Anybody can be, either the president or Bill Gates or whatever it is that people are told they ought to aspire to be. So we got a lot of work to do, in other words, on that level of propaganda before we can really, I think, effectively use the language of any revolution. And it doesn't mean it's not a legitimate, valuable idea. It means that as of now, it's one of those ideas that is a non-starter with people, not just because we don't use the word, but because they think they know what it means. And they think what it means, it is not necessarily what it means at all, but we've got years of propaganda to undo. At the same time, we're also counter-revolutionary because we're a huge country spread out over a large landmass with a lot of people from disparate backgrounds. It makes it very difficult to think in terms of a national revolution that would truly be similar to those that we may see in smaller countries, whether they ended up being, truly liberating revolutions or not. In other places, those revolutions have tended to be much more manageable. They've been much more localized in smaller countries. They've not been on the vast scale that we're talking about in the modern era, where you also have the ability of corporate folks to literally pull their capital at the first sign of revolution and invest it wherever they want. That becomes a real issue. We have to figure out how we stanch the flow of capital flight, because if there's any sign of revolution, there's just simply a rebellion in Madison, Wisconsin, and folks are talking about calling out National Guard. If you really think, if at some point we actually get to the cusp of real revolutionary change, it's not just going to be the National Guard, right? It's going to be slaughter, and it's going to be capitalists saying, we don't have to stay here. We'll take our money, and we'll put it in the Cayman Islands, and we'll do everything offshore. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have revolution, but it means we're going to have to think about it in a really different way from the way that it's been discussed, I think, up to now. And if we're ever going to get to that point, we have to talk about structural change and these sort of steps that come before revolution. Because any revolution that's ever been successful, there have been steps, incremental steps that took place before that served to incentivize that revolutionary action, served to give people the idea that it could work. I remember this, and I'll let you get out of here because I know it's getting late. This lesson is something I learned when I was in New Orleans and doing community organizing. And it was, I was talking to one of these lead organizers about the work they were doing in the community. And my thing was, I'm this, radical college grad. I think I know everything. I don't know anything, And I go into the community and I'm talking to this guy and I'm saying, so what are you all working on, And I'm thinking the answer is going to be, police brutality, institutional poverty, institutional racism, all this big stuff that I know is important. He looks at me and says, right now, we're trying to get a stoplight at that intersection. And I said, I don't get it. I didn't understand. I said, I don't really, what do you mean a stoplight? To me, that seemed awfully small stuff. We got these big issues. We got institutional oppression, man. You got to overthrow this place. You got to do some serious stuff. And he's like, cool. He's like, I know that. And all of these folks in this neighborhood know. But here's the problem. If we go to them and say, we're organizing for the overthrow of economic oppression and white supremacy, two things I know will happen. This is him telling me. He said, number one, it ain't going to happen by next week. And it ain't going to happen by next year. And after a while, if that's the only goal you put out in front of you, and that's it, and that's what we're fighting for, people get burned out, they get frustrated, they become pessimistic, even cynical that any change is possible. So on the other hand, we can get that stoplight. So I know we can get it. And if we get the stoplight, then, and he said, first of all, I understand why we needed 4 kids to get on bicycles at that intersection, because there's no stoplight and cars hit them. So it's a practical need. But more importantly, it's an incentivizing thing. If we get the stoplight, then we say, okay, what's next? And we ratchet up a little bit. And we ratchet up a little bit. And then the community says they get a sense of their own power. They get a sense of their own ability, their own efficacy to make change. It's one of those things that in this training tomorrow, Undoing Racism training the People's Institute is doing. It was the folks at the People's Institute, now that's not who I had that conversation with, but they were the ones who really explained to me, as I was doing organizing, what organizing is. Organizing is about fundamentally making sure that people have a sense of their power. And they never will get a sense of their power if you don't pick off some small victories. You've got to have some small victories. So even though I think many of us want to see that kind of fundamental change that we may call revolution, the only way people get to that mindset is to know that they can win the little fights. Because if they don't think they can win the little fights, they definitely will not think that they can win the big fights. There's no way. But I appreciate that question. I appreciate you all being here tonight. Thank you all.